breaking down everyday workplace issues and diagnosing the hidden sickness, not just the obvious symptom. Our hosts, James and Kobe.
Did we lose a patient?
No, that's just my lunch.
Hey, thanks for joining us. I'm Kobe, and he's James. And before we get started, I think we should make some comments to say how much we appreciate you, our listeners.
Yeah, I mean, what's great is that we've been having more folks reaching out to us fairly regularly. We've had several emails, texts, and even a thank you card. So that was actually kind of cool. Really appreciated it. Actually, in fact, this episode, what we are eventually going to talk about today is a request from one of our listeners who asked if we could actually dig in a bit deeper into the psychology behind the conversation that we had around emotional load. So we really appreciate the feedback, appreciate people. I'm constantly amazed and appreciate the fact that people actually listen to us rant about different things.
Yeah, and I mean, because we're just kind of here, two guys just talking into our computers, really about about stuff about kind of the work that we do and some of the stuff that we see. But it's also kind of cool. Like I think it's also worth noticing that some of our listeners have shared kind of our podcast being recognized on like some lists and through some
Yeah.
like best podcast lists and and even in kind of some articles, stuff like that. One thing that was shared with me that I really want to like say how like excited I am by it was in a recent article in HR Digest. We in our podcast was kind of ranked in some of the best podcasts of 2025, and this was a quote that HR Digest said about our podcast. I quote, "This is one of the best HR management podcasts to listen to right now." I was blown away by that. And again, so thank you so much to HR Digest. And another thing that's really cool is that so we routinely are on FeedSpot's Best Canadian Workplace podcast lists of and we were number one in January of this year, and they update that list on a regular basis. I think a couple times a month. And here we are. We're recording this kind of in October, and we're still
Still number one, baby.
yeah, so number one on the best Canadian podcast. So update at the end of September. So like again, thank you to all of our listeners. Thank you to those publications that kind of acknowledge us and everything like that. We're just so humbled by it. And again, please to you listeners, please reach out to us. You can message us right in the show notes. You can send us an email. Our email address is in the show notes. We just love hearing from you. And again, we love when we can tailor our topics and our conversations around things that you legitimately want to hear more about.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I just want to get that out. I just want to make sure that we took the time to say how much we appreciate you, the listener. Yeah. So why don't we dig into it and I'll jump into our question.
Sure.
All right. So our question for today is, why am I so exhausted after work every day?
Yeah. Well, if you work with me, the answer is quite clear. I've been told that I am absolutely exhausting to be around.
Absolutely. Preach.
Yeah. But aside from that, the reality boils down to, the physical, mental, and emotional load that's placed on us in our work, right? And it's really those three areas that I want to focus our conversation around.
Mhm.
There are just so many factors that contribute to an individual's physical, mental, and emotional health that there's really no realistic way that we can cover all of those pieces in a single podcast. So instead, what I'd like to do is really focus on the psychology around those three areas and give you a chance, Kobe, to kind of geek out on the psychology end of things. So
Always happy to geek out.
get your geek on, my friend.
Yeah. So, and again, this was, so we did an episode, a couple episodes ago, one of our first episode on leadership tips, where we talked about emotional load. And I tried to not geek out on the psychology side of that because
We
that
had to
would,
rein him in a little bit, which I could see it physically hurting him. It was awesome.
So again, we said, if anyone wants us to talk about this, please let us know. We had a couple of people actually reach out and be like, yeah, could you, dip into that a little bit more? So I was very excited for this episode. And we're going to get to talking about emotional health and emotional load in a bit, but I think that you're right. We need to just we're talking about exhaustion. Why are we exhausted after work? We should really kind of dig into physical, mental, and emotional health kind of a little bit, and then we'll talk about more
Mhm.
about emotional health, emotional load as we go. But I think in the context of work, I think that why people are exhausted at work, the question is kind of who's ultimately responsible for the exhaustion that I as an employee or I as as a regular employee, I as a manager, I as a leader that I feel. And I think that it's something that it's worth us kind of briefly talking a little bit about kind of what are obligations that companies have around physical, mental, and emotional health, and what are just really supportive opportunities that
Mhm.
they have. So let's just kind of touch on physical a little bit because again, we'll do physical and mental, and then we'll spend most of the time talking about emotional.
Yeah.
Um, when it comes to physical, I think that it's a matter of realizing that there are like five really core things that we need to be doing to kind of take care of ourselves. And the idea of getting enough sleep and rest, taking our medications, making sure that they're prescribed properly and that we're using them properly, eating proper food, making sure that we're not just eating stuff that's high in sugar or or high in calories, that we're staying hydrated, that we're drinking enough, and that we're having enough hydration in our bodies, and that we're getting enough exercise, moving our bodies enough that we're actually able to kind of be able to again have the physical energy that we need for our work. And I think that that's when we talk about physical health, we're really talking about kind of those really about those five things.
And those are really the pieces. So there's obviously the individual responsibilities, right? Like there are things that I have to do in my own life that no employer, no business is going to do for me, right? I need to take ownership over my own sleep patterns, and if I require medications, that I'm taking them regularly, all of those different pieces that you just kind of laid out.
Mhm.
So from an individual perspective, I think most people get that. I think that we're not breaking new ground on the what the individual responsibilities are.
Mhm.
I mean, yeah, I know I need to get more sleep, drink more water. I live off of coffee in order to get me through the day. Is kind of the mentality though. So
Mhm.
I think there's also the interplay between how our, the cognitive and the emotional load kind of limit our ability to,
Yeah.
not ability, but certainly motivation.
Yeah.
Certainly, there is an interplay between all three elements.
Absolutely. Yeah, but I mean, we're keeping kind of with the physical health side of it. So kind of saying those five things, and again, we've got a little acronym that we heard called SMILE to help you remember what those five things are. S for sleep well, M for medications matter, I for intake nutrition, L for liquids, this for life, stay hydrated, and E for exercise regularly, right? So if you want to know the five things, that's a little thing that we heard that would thought might be helpful. But going back to obligations and supportive opportunities, right?
Yeah.
Again, you're right. Those are the things that we personally need to be able to do. And there are obligations that our employers, our companies kind of have to help us with that. Part of that is when it comes to things like, um, nutrition, that they're paying us properly, that we can actually afford food that will sustain us, right? There is a
Hmm.
requirement that our pay be sufficient to allow us in order to be able to ingest foods that will be helpful, beneficial to us, and not, end up, again, high salt or high sugar, those things that will hurt us, right? And it's also the idea of making sure that we have enough time to physically rest between shifts so that we can get enough sleep. And ideally, and if there's opportunities for us to have to not require our medications be counterproductive to our work habits, and accommodate those kinds of things too, right? And then so that's kind of where the obligations live. But then the supportive opportunities around, we can also do some extra things above those minimum opportunities or minimum obligations. We can talk about, like health challenges. Like our organization that we work with, recently did a steps challenge to staff where they put out a challenge organization wide and they had a leaderboard and competition and prizes. Those type of encouraging
Hmm.
healthier habits is something that you can do above and beyond the minimum obligations.
Yeah, I think on the obligations piece, what I also want to look at is um, if you have a physically demanding role, you also have an obligation to ensure that people have the right tools, the right structure, that it is set, that your operations are structured in a way that actually support people's physical health. Operational requirements are important. And if you have if you are in an industry that is very, has a lot of physicality by nature, there's a lot of lifting, bending, whatever that physical nature is, there is an obligation, and this is something that we see the vast majority of employers take very, very seriously,
Yep.
is the making sure that that the physical requirements of the job are done safely, that people are supported, that they have the right tools and resources. And I mean, a lot of that is because we have legislation to back these things up. Right. Same with rest periods, right? We have legislation to back up the fact that, there are a recognition that you can't push people beyond their limit, that people need a chance to rest, not only during their shift, but also how frequently you can pull them back into the workplace, right? And what a reasonable rest period is in between shifts. So I don't want to make sure that we're not missing the obligation piece, but
Mhm.
something else that I want to touch on that you mentioned, and I don't want to take us off course because this could be a much larger conversation, but when we're talking about the sufficiency of wages in order to allow people that to buy groceries, which are stupidly expensive and getting worse, that sufficiency piece goes to a concept that we've talked about before around how expensive it is
Mhm.
to pay poverty wages.
Right.
And you are many times creating your own problems by
Mhm.
paying a wage that doesn't allow your workforce to properly support themselves and live, because the stress that comes from it, the inability um, to purchase groceries to that will actually support their nutrition, it is exceedingly expensive to pay to the business
Mhm.
to pay poverty rate wages.
Right. So going back to the question, why am I so exhausted after work every day from a physical perspective? There is that piece of if the workplace is not allowing you to rest properly, it's
Hmm.
not providing you with the support you need to be able to pay for medications to manage any kind of health issues. If it's blocking your ability to take in nutritious foods, if it's not allowing for enough breaks and scheduling for you to kind of stay hydrated and maintain your, the your body's requirement for water intake, and you're not able to have any kind of ability to kind of improve your exercise so that you've got the physical strength in order to do the jobs that you do, or like you said, or that physical side of it as far as tools
Hmm.
instead of wearing you out physically. Those are the obligation pieces. If the obligations are, if your workplace is blocking your ability to do those five things, an obligation for the organization is to fix those things. And then encouraging healthier habits beyond those obligations are other opportunities that you can look at too. All right, so I want to move on because, again, I
Hmm.
think it is important. We have to make sure that we reference the three elements, but I do want to leave enough time to get into emotional. So let's kind of touch on mental. Now, mental health is kind of, we're getting into more of the psychology pieces too, but one of the things that I want to talk a little bit about with mental health is, again, obligations and supports. Obligations are really about, like if you're able to provide benefits to people, that you're kind of obligated to have the benefits that you're providing kind of help with mental health, providing, SAP supports around mental wellness and those types of things. Those are really kind of things that, again, if you're able to provide those things, that you're making sure you're prioritizing proper mental health care.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, you're not under a legal obligation to provide benefits. I
Mm.
mean, it's a great perk and a great thing to be able to do if you are. And I just want to make sure that we're clear in what we're saying, that if you are going to provide benefits, the point of providing them is literally to address physical, emotional, and mental health, right? That's why we are put benefits packages in place. That's why they cover a range of different resources and supports. And mental health is more pro I won't say it's more important than ever because it's always been important, but it's certainly more prominent. And it certainly seems to becoming more and more of a front burner issue for many people.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yes, and again, another obligation you have as an organization is to not overwork people and to burn
Yes.
them out, right? So the idea of like chronic stress. So kind of this gets into some of the psychology around what's called cognitive labor. So cognitive labor is kind of the mental toll that it takes on us to anticipate needs, manage tasks, manage kind of emotions of other people, and also manage our time. So rather than just being than a physical exhaustion, cognitive labor is about the mental exhaustion that happens with a lot of the stress and pressures that we put on us. This kind of mental load can lead to chronic stress, it can lead to mental exhaustion, it can lead to burnout, and it can really lower the mental
Mm.
well-being when our workload is disproportionately high or the demands of pressure are disproportionately high. So there is an obligation to organizations to understand the impact of cognitive labor and to be able to actually try to mitigate that and not burn people out. I do feel there's an obligation to organizations to not burn people out and to be aware of the pressure they're putting on people.
Yeah, I mean, this idea that you have an unending labor pool that you can just burn through with no problems, that ain't the reality.
Yeah.
And it hasn't been for some time, and I don't see it changing in the short to medium term at the very least. But what's interesting, what came up for me as you were describing cognitive load, is how your manager can play such a significant part of that. Because could you just go through, because it was around how you manage these different responsibilities. Could you just touch on that for me
Yeah,
again?
so cognitive labor is about the
Cognitive labor, yeah.
yeah, is about idea it's like the pressure or the work is required to anticipate needs, manage
Right.
tasks, deal with all the those sort of things.
That was the piece that came up, the anticipation.
Hmm.
Because when you have, this is why management skills, this is why having properly trained and supported managers is so critical.
Hmm.
Because we've talked so many times about how the inconsistency in management expectations, this idea of having to walk on eggshells because you're trying to anticipate what might be coming down the pike from a manager. This day is going to be different from another day, and the stress that puts on you on top of all the other aspects. It seems to tie in really closely with this cognitive labor.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that's, I think, a really important thing for people to realize too is that when it comes to cognitive labor, the heavier the cognitive labor that you carry and the more persistent that labor is, it does increase the risks of depression and depressive
Okay.
symptoms, right? The idea of it's that the overwhelming wave that can hit you from excessive cognitive labor is one of those things that can activate kind of those depressive symptoms that make people kind of spiral. And kind of getting into kind of the brain chemistry around cognitive labor is the idea of the chemicals that impact our stress response. So cortisol, okay, cortisol is the hormone that is our stress hormone, and it's what prepares us for fight or flight. But the idea of consistently high cortisol levels increased stress responses, which have not just a mental, which affect our cognitive labor and our mental load, starts to seep into the physical stress that starts to impact our physical health as well, and which makes us increase our needs for medications or increases our needs for sleep, which makes sleep even harder, and then create a snowballing effect. So there really is there's a lot of ties to the impact of cognitive labor and kind of depressive symptoms, but also kind of the more stress that we feel, the higher our cortisol levels, and the more it starts impacting us physically as well as mentally.
Yeah, and I think we need to, so tying this back to the workplace and why this actually matters from a business perspective is this, bar none, the biggest challenge that comes up every day when talking with businesses in, and it's not just us talking to businesses, it's any conversation. The ability to attract and retain the workforce that you need in order to be successful, in order to even just keep your operations running as they are, let alone the to meet your goals around internal, external growth and scalability and reaching new markets or delivering on new products. You can't do that if you are constantly running short staffed, and you can't deliver on any of those things if you are constantly putting this cognitive load on people. As I said, physical businesses are really trained well and understand the need to provide physical safety and for their employees, and do it usually really quite well.
Yep.
But the cognitive aspect is something that we don't consider. And the way that your operations are structured and the way that your managers are trained or not trained and support it is going to have as big of an impact. When those cracks start to show,
Hmm.
it can be just as damaging as a physical accident.
Right. One thing that's also important to mention when it comes to mental health is that our our biology, our childhood, our upbringing, all those kind of things, a lot of outside the workplace daily factors
Hmm.
impact our mental health. And it's something that, it's the idea of like, but like part of which, I mean, it's funny, you've railed against the phrase of leave your baggage, leave it at the door type of
Yeah.
mentality. You hate that. And part of it is that businesses can't do that because of how complex mental health is, right? So the idea like, like so knowing that you're obligated as an organization to really do the things required so people can take care of themselves, but also not adding to the mental health through stacking cognitive labor on
Yeah.
top of what people already are bringing to their jobs. So being aware of that, there is the reality of like like our workplaces impact our mental health, and we're gonna get when we get to emotional health, to talk about how there's a much bigger role to play around emotional health. But it is important to acknowledge that again, physical health is something that is we have things that we can do to kind of keep our physical health going, and it's pretty
Yeah.
simple. Mental health is so complex, and it is complex around our our childhood impacts it, our current relationships impact it, our work it does impact it, but it's not isolated with work. So it's important to recognize that.
It's not a single thing. I
Yeah.
mean, when we're talking about an obligation from business perspective to support these, it's an obligation not to make things worse, not to actively make things worse,
Right.
right?
And a business might be asked, okay, so how do I not make it worse, right?
Yeah.
And I think coming back to the idea of cognitive labor, right? So one of the things that we talk about like, again, the impact that our managers have on our mental health
Yeah.
is pretty significant. And going back to the specific things I listed in cognitive labor, anticipating needs that you mentioned is a good example of, what, if you as a manager are cryptic or inconsistent or expect people to kind of crystal ball read your mind, you are unintentionally creating a massive cognitive labor onto your staff for no reason.
And that's the problem, is that, again, I don't believe that businesses operate under a sinister mentality of I'm going to actively create problems for my employees.
No.
That doesn't happen despite what your employees might actually think.
Right.
However, the unintended consequences of not supporting people, of not training your managers, of not setting those expectations, and of not being consistent
Right.
has a direct impact on these things. And you do have an obligation to not actively make people's lives worse.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are things, yeah. So I think if you are a manager or even if you're an employee, you're like, okay, so I am now aware of the cognitive labor concept.
Hmm.
And how do I help this? Well, part of it is, again, understanding that cognitive labor is the work people put into trying to, like, again, anticipate needs and manage tasks and kind of deal with the added pressures of kind of navigating relationships and people's needs
Hmm.
and trying to figure all that out. So one of the things that you can do is seek like concrete clarity. seek the idea of, I don't want to read your mind. What, like, I don't say this part, but like, I want to know, the cold hard facts. I want to know the clear outcomes. I don't want to have to constantly anticipate needs and do all these do these cognitive backflips to try to crystal ball read your mind when you could just be clear in communication, right? So just being aware of little things that we can do to make the cognitive labor less can be ways that we can help ourselves and that we can help our teams.
Yeah, and this is why it's important to sometimes to get outside help too,
Yeah.
because you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
And it takes to be that self-reflective. If you're not sure if you're causing these problems, I mean, again, I don't believe that these are intentional behaviors, right? So expecting somebody to be able to self-identify those behaviors that they don't even identify in the first place is a big ask. But
Right.
this is where external help can make a huge difference. Leadership coaching. There are phenomenal leadership coaches who we've worked with who are
Mhm.
wonderful and excel at what they do.
Right.
Um, we are pretty good ourselves, not as leadership coaches, but the management training side of things. But there are lots of resources out there. It is on you to find the resources to help you identify these challenges.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So going back to again the question, of why am I so exhausted at work every day? Well, it comes to kind of the mental health side of it, the cognitive labor side. You're putting in a full-time job up here in your head
Hmm.
if your job or your manager or your team or your employees require a lot of cognitive labor from you. And then one thing that we should also talk about too is sometimes managers try their best, but they've got very needy teams that require them to kind of constantly juggle those types of things too. And
Hmm.
that's a fair point too, right? The cognitive labor is something that you have to find a way to try and reduce the cognitive labor, whether that's on, you're reducing it for yourself, you're reducing it for your team, or you're working on both. But again, you're right. Figuring out for yourself may be a bit tough. Getting some help and some assistance with that could go a long way. But that's when it comes to mental health, I think the cognitive labor piece is why we go home exhausted every day.
So is this part of is cognitive labor
Mhm.
the kind of the crux of not being able to shut my brain off when I get home, not being able to, like, I can't take my physical health because I can't sleep properly because I'm worried about what is happening, what I'm going to be walking into the next day.
Yep. Yeah, it is.
Okay.
A lot of that stuff is that when it starts to really weigh on our mental health, it is that cognitive labor piece. It's all the work we're doing mentally to
Right.
try to anticipate, manage, plan, organize, you know,
So you
de-stress.
really put in a full day of work physically and mentally in the workplace. And then if you've got this cognitive load, you're you're really not ever disconnecting from work and you're
No,
not getting that any chance to really
no, you're
rest.
often putting in a full day's work when you get home, plus your home requirements of
Yeah.
managing anticipating needs of your kids or your spouse or your
Yeah.
parents or so I mean it's just again it's the workplace needs to know the obligations but not adding the stuff, right? And
Yeah.
that's yeah. So let's move on to just the emotional stuff because I want to make sure that we have enough time for this too. Um, just kind of recap, we talked about emotional load in the episode, our leadership tips episode, like I mentioned before. The idea of kind of it's emotional load is kind of the weight that we carry, kind of like emotionally from the things that stress us out, and from kind of the ability to, again, really kind of understand, the the interactions around people, the personal kind of conflicts and all those types of pieces. But really, it's about kind of like it's about appraising stressors. So the theory that emotional load kind of comes from is what's called the cognitive appraisal theory. And this is really about whether or not we see things that are stressors, so things that are, again, points of concern or potential areas of concern or those kinds of things, whether we see them as a threat or as a manageable challenge. And that's really kind of what starts to impact the emotional load pieces. So the cognitive appraisal theory kind of suggests that emotions, stress, and our responses to them are not just triggered by the events but by the interpretation we have of those events. So sometimes it's about reading like it's about kind of reading the kind of the context or how people took that, or sometimes it's a matter of the second guessing. Oh, that seemed fine in the moment, but then I overthink it afterwards. Sometimes there's
Okay.
that side of it too, but it's the idea of, it's like, is this situation, which is largely, is something that you might deal with on on a regular basis, or a big thing, is it considered a threat, or is it a manageable challenge? But the idea of, it's about how we appraise these pieces, which really kind of adds to our emotional load, because we're having an emotional response to a situation. And it's really that idea of, it's about kind of like, our, like, so that the theory, one of the main theorists is Lazarus. And the way that he positions it in the cognitive appraisal theory is that our subjective assessment of a situation's significance to our well-being and our ability to cope with it, that determines our emotional response. So the
Okay.
subjective assessment that we have and then we figure out what our emotional response will be based on how we perceive it.
Okay. So one of the things so I'm trying to right now to get some clarity in my mind around where, because cognitive labor seem and emotional load seem to be very closely tied, interconnected, and I'm trying to find a line that might not exist between the two.
Sure.
Um, so with cognitive labor, I kind of get, and from our conversation, I get where that comes from, the anticipation, the
Mhm.
mental health impacts, the things that we were thinking about. So is it really, with emotional load, is it more the emotional reaction to like the same type of events, that anticipation of inconsistencies, the management piece? Is it that those same actions can contribute to our cognitive labor, as well as the emotional response that we have to it is what adds to our emotional load? Is that the distinction, or
Yeah.
am I getting that wrong?
No, no, no. I think you're right. And again, I appreciate you seeking kind of clarity on this. So yeah, the cognitive labor is more like, it's the work of the thinking. It's almost like just the amount of the planning,
The amount
the
of brain power that is
right.
required to put, okay,
Yeah, and then the emotional load is the weight that carries kind of to your emotional reactions of things, right? So it's almost like the cognitive labor is a bit subjective, or
okay,
sorry, it's a bit objective. It's a bit
yeah,
of like, it's like lists and plans and this and that. How am I going to solve this problem? I got to respond to that email and those types of kind of things. That we kind of like, the mental work that we do. Where emotional load is how that affects us. This individual person, how this person triggers our emotional pieces. Those kinds
okay, okay. So yeah, I mean, I'm
of.
asking the question because this is squarely in your domain and your expertise more so than mine.
Mhm.
So one of the ways, what came up for me as you're describing that is, have conversations that I've had with employees at different, in different roles. You know, I can think of an example of an employee who was very much burnt out, and responded very like a raw nerve, and responded emotionally to everything. And the physicality of the work and the cognitive load that and the stress of the workplace is what kind of caused this emotional reaction. But that it kind of built up to a point where their emotional load became a breaking point,
Right.
and they everything when they hit that breaking point with their emotional load, every response to every interaction, reaction, problem that came up, the first response was emotional, because that's where their head was at. That's where everything, like,
Mhm.
and they very much recognized it in themselves. But because they were fully immersed in this and still continue to be immersed in it, they didn't have the emotional regulation. They weren't able to regulate their emotions in the workplace in a professional manner.
Mhm.
And so like it all stemmed, like it kind of started with the physical aspect, and workload aspect, moved to the cognitive, um, piece of, the stress that came with the increased workload, the stress that came from, being the only senior, the only team member who lasted more than a year or two. You
Right.
know, these stressors eventually built up the emotional load to a point where they could not respond without that emotional
Yeah.
aspect. So
Yeah.
that to me is kind of that burnout example seems to be a very clear progression of how this can just build until somebody snaps.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, so I think another example is I remember I had a conversation a little while ago in one of our management training sessions with a manager who was talking about they've got an employee who, is like part of their job is to kind of like dig up information for the different departments,
Mhm.
and this manager was saying how exhausted they are with this one employee whose job it is to do that because they'll call the manager up and just be like like this one manager is like is like asking this kind of out of nowhere and kind of wants like all this stuff done at a moment's notice and this and this and this and this and this, and the manager's like, well, hold on, don't you remember about 2 weeks ago we talked about this was going to be something that we were going to do together and then we were going to work towards it and they had realistic timelines and this request was more of a simple reminding ask of this.
Right, right.
And they were and the manager said this to the employee, don't you remember that? And they were like, oh, right, okay, yeah. And then is you're like, is the work too much? Or she's like, no, 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 it's just I just okay, now that I know that, then okay, cool. And what happened there was the employee had an emotional reaction, I'm assuming to this other manager's request, likely because there's a bit of a an emotional
History there.
conflict between them. Yeah, so
Yeah.
they had they had a huge emotional load attached to this relationship. Whereas the cognitive labor that was required of them was within normal scope.
So you said
So
something there that I want to touch on. The emotional load was tied to this relationship or this person.
yeah,
So the emotional load, it's not a single thing, right? It can be situational. It can
yeah,
be the emotions that are, yeah, I mean, that makes sense as I'm
yeah.
talking it out.
Because again, going back to the cognitive appraisal theory, it stems from how we appraise stressors. So
Right.
so for this employee getting a request from this other manager for something that required not a significant cognitive labor, but because this employee kind of appraised this manager as a threat, they had a highly emotional loaded
Right.
reaction to something that required not a significant amount of cognitive labor.
Right.
Whereas the
And that
other,
emotional load was built over time because of their interactions, because of
right.
misunderstandings, because of all of these different pieces.
Yes. And to the manager that was telling me the story, one of the things they said was they said what's funny was if that same again request had come from this other manager, the employee w wouldn't have phased them at all. They would have just
Yeah.
laughingly said sure, and it would have been nothing. But
Right.
because of the emotional load that is in that relationship, that stressor, right? How they appraise that person and that's what caused a higher emotional load.
So, and this may be taking us too far off course or may not be an appropriate question for this conversation, but how the connection or the relationship between emotional load and emotional trauma. Like we've talked about trauma infused workplaces
Yep.
previously, and we've talked about how, these historical events, whether it's people feeling betrayed by the organization, or these interpersonal relationships can over time build. So is there a distinction there? Is it a
Yep.
difference without a distinction? Is there a clear distinction between those two, or
No, so I think that the trauma I think is how we'd label the appraisal of that stress,
okay.
right?
Yep.
So the idea of like so again, I know another organization, the management team had a very authoritarian CEO. And so I remember working with them. Everything was hitting that raw nerve that you kind of mentioned in
Yeah.
your example. Simple requests were seen as directives of, like change course immediately based on this offhand comment that I made. So everything was so there's a lot of trauma with sharing a new idea or a new thinking caused major trauma with this team because he was always just so like, because again of how their past was.
Yeah.
This tainted how they appraise the new stressors.
Okay.
Yeah. So our trauma impacts that appraisal process that we have to figure out if there are threats or manageable challenges. It overweighs things to be more threatening than actually would be intended. So the
Right.
emotional load is actually kind of like so your total emotional load is almost different than your individual emotional load, and your total emotional load is just that, all the little loads that you carry with interactions with your triggers, with your traumas, stack up, and then it's the total that you're carrying. So one of the things that we mentioned in the last episode, or we talked about this in the leadership episode, was I said the best way to figure out how to manage your emotional load is to start to measure what sets you off and gives you an emotional response. What triggers that cortisol response where you're in fight or flight? And then to try, is it people? Is it times? Is it areas of your work? And try and track what is the emotional triggers that you're getting. So again, how are you appraising these stressors or these incidences as threats or something totally manageable? And if you can gauge that, you'll have a better idea about your emotional load so that you can actually start to say, okay, objectively, are these actual threats or am I kind of like, overweighing it? Is my trauma from past experiences tainting this appraisal I have of this stress or whatever it is? But that tracking piece is a great way to get started trying to reduce or better understand your emotional load.
So, big surprise here is that one of the things that you can do to begin to remedy this is to start diagnosing not the symptom, but the sickness.
Absolutely. Yes.
Wow. Shocker.
I know, right?
It's not on brand at all.
Yeah. So again, there is like again, so with all of these things, physical, mental, and emotional, there's a lot of like legitimate, actual things. There are obligations that
Yeah.
organizations can try and do, and there are supportive things that they can play. And when it comes to the emotional side of it, there are so many more obligations that companies have. Again, kind of going back to similar to the mental health, it's about not making things worse, but it's as managers we have to understand the emotional load that our employees carry and
Yeah.
better understand how we can help them navigate them. We can't fix them, but one thing we have to try and do, all employees, regardless if you're in management, leadership or not, you need to understand your emotional load because your emotional load is what is probably one of the biggest reasons why you're going home tired every day.
Yeah. And what's incredibly important for managers is in understanding these different components is that it allows you to approach the the actions that you are seeing, the problematic behaviors that you're seeing, the disproportionate emotional responses to a simple request or a directive, or like the behaviors that might touch into like the performance management system are coming from somewheres, right?
Hmm.
And if you understand how emotional load, cognitive labor, and physical health contribute along the way in each of those areas, it allows you to, just like we've been joking, you have to diagnose what's behind the scenes. The same is true when you're entering these conversations with your employees. And if you can start to identify that these behaviors that are problematic are actually stemming from a person's emotional load, or they're actually stemming from a person's cognitive labor, or like there are root causes to them, then we can start to put strategies in place that will actually make a difference, right?
Hmm.
You're not going to make a difference just slapping a band-aid over an amputated arm. That
Right.
doesn't do much. right? If we can actually get to the root cause of the issue, or even start to peel back the layers, because this is complex and messy. But you can't do it all. You don't have to do it all, but you do have an obligation to try to support your employees in the best way that you know how. And now that you know more, you can do more.
Honestly, dude, that was a terrific summary. Probably.
I am fantastic.
Well, actually, no, I was more shocked at how good the summary was.
Oh,
No, that's a great. No, that's a great summary. And again, just tying everything back to the idea that this is why I go home exhausted every day after work, is
Yeah.
because of the things you just talked about, because of the things that kind of pull on my physical health, the cognitive labor that I'm carrying, and the emotional load of how I deal with different interactions with different people and different stressors. And you're right, understanding it is the first step towards improving it. So now that you have more, maybe some clarity around it, maybe you can start to, again, track it, or maybe you can start to actually see some beneficial progression to start to go home with some more energy.
Mhm.
All right, cool. So that about does it for us. For a full archive of our podcast and access to the video versions hosted on our YouTube channel, visit roman3.ca/podcast. Thanks for joining us.
For more information on topics like these, don't forget to visit us at roman3.ca. Side effects of this podcast may include improved retention, high productivity, increased market share, employees breaking out in spontaneous dance, dry mouth, aversion to the sound of James's voice, desire to find a better podcast.